"How will you stay if I sleep with you?" the Apache girl asked the lone cowboy after being saved. Her voice was soft, but the question hung in the air, heavy with meaning and mystery. The lone cowboy, having rescued her from certain death, found himself at a crossroads, unsure of what her request truly meant and why it shook him so deeply. Was it desperation? Or was there something more between them that neither of them could ignore? The wind howled across the arid plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of danger. In the distance, the remnants of an Apache village smoldered, black smoke rising like a funeral pyre for the lives lost in the brutal raid. Among the charred earth and fallen bodies, one figure remained, an Apache girl no older than 16, her face bruised and bloodied, her spirit not yet broken. Her name was Nara, and she had witnessed the death of her people, her family, her home. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the ravaged landscape, a lone cowboy appeared, his silhouette framed by the dying light. His name was Cole, a man who had seen too much of this world's cruelty to believe in redemption. Yet here he was, drawn by something more than just the scent of violence. He had been passing through when he stumbled upon Nara, lying unconscious beside the wreckage. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle. Cole had no plans to stay in this forsaken land, no desire to get entangled in anyone else's pain. But when he looked down at Nara, the girl with the piercing dark eyes, something stirred in him. He couldn't leave her to die alone, not when he could offer her the one thing he had left, life. His calloused hands gently lifted her, cradling her against him, as if he could somehow shield her from the horrors that had shattered her world. As they traveled through the barren landscape, Nara remained silent, her body too broken to speak, yet her gaze never wavered. When they reached the shelter of a rocky outcrop, Cole laid her down carefully, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. She stirred, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you stay if I sleep with you?" The question hung in the air, charged with a mixture of desperation and hope. Cole didn't answer immediately. What could he say? He was a man who had learned to walk away from everything, yet somehow, this girl had made him stop. Cole knelt beside her, the firelight flickering in her dark eyes as she watched him, waiting for an answer. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and in the quiet of the night, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind sweeping through the canyon. Cole had always prided himself on his ability to stay detached, to avoid the kind of emotional entanglements that could weaken a man. But this girl, this Apache girl, was different. Her question had caught him off guard, and it lingered in his mind like a distant echo. "Will you stay if I sleep with you?" she had asked, her voice fragile but direct, a question born of necessity rather than desire. What did it mean? Was it a plea for comfort, a cry for survival, or something deeper, something that reached into the very heart of their shared humanity? He didn't know, and maybe that was why he couldn't walk away. He studied her face. Her features were sharp, defined by hardship and loss, but there was something unyielding in her gaze, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by the cruelty of the world. She had seen the worst of humanity, and yet she remained. Somehow, she had survived, and in that survival, she had a strength that Cole hadn't encountered in many people. He respected that. Hell, he admired it. "Sleep," Cole said finally, his voice hoarse. He had no answers, no assurances. He only knew that in this broken world, survival often came down to moments like these, moments where two people found a way to keep going, together. It wasn't about promises or grand gestures. It was about finding solace in the smallest things. Nara lay back on the bedroll, her body stiff, but her eyes closing with the weariness of someone who had been awake far too long. Cole remained sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, his mind racing with the enormity of the situation. What was he doing here? He had no reason to stay. He was a cowboy, a drifter, a man who moved from place to place, never looking back. But now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself rooted to this spot, as if the universe had tied him to this moment. The wind howled louder, and Nara shifted in her sleep, her breathing shallow. Cole looked over at her, her fragile form wrapped in a blanket, and something twisted in his chest. He wasn't a hero. He had never been one, But for some reason, he felt like he needed to protect her, to offer her whatever security he could, even if it was fleeting. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant hoofbeats, soft at first, but growing louder. The thud of horses' hooves on the rocky ground made his heart rate spike. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't a good sign. The raiders, those who had left Nara for dead, couldn't be far behind. Cole's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his side, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He stood, stepping lightly over the rocks, to crouch beside the girl. He hesitated for a moment, looking down at her peaceful face, before gently shaking her shoulder. "Nara," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We've got company. You need to wake up. Stay quiet." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, confusion written across her face. But when she saw the look on his face, a realization seemed to dawn on her. She sat up quickly, her movements sharp and controlled, as though she had already endured the worst this world had to offer. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "Raiders," she whispered back, her voice hoarse but steady. She had heard the sounds too. She knew what that meant. Cole nodded, motioning for her to stay down. "We're not going anywhere until we know it's safe. I'll keep watch." Nara's eyes narrowed, and she gave a small, silent nod. Then, without a word, she shifted closer to the edge of the outcrop, her movements fluid and practiced. She knew how to survive in this harsh world, how to fight when necessary, how to stay alive when every instinct told you to run. Cole couldn't help but watch her, his admiration for her growing with every silent move she made. This girl who had lost everything was still willing to fight. The sound of the hoofbeats grew louder, closer now. Cole's hand tightened around his pistol, his gaze scanning the darkness. He could feel his pulse quicken. Whoever was coming, they weren't friendly. He had no idea how many there were, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let them get to Nara. Not after everything she had been through. Nara's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "They're coming from the south." Cole nodded again, his mind working quickly. They would have to be ready. His instincts told him that running wouldn't be an option. They were too exposed. The only way out would be through. He glanced at Nara, who was already gathering what little supplies they had left, preparing for whatever was about to come. In that moment, he realized something else. He wasn't just protecting her, he was fighting alongside her. They weren't two strangers anymore. They were a team. As the hoofbeats grew louder, Nara whispered, "Will you stay, even if this is the end?" Cole didn't answer immediately. The question hung in the air, like everything else that was unspoken between them. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes steady. "Until it's over," he said simply. Just then, the shadows shifted, and the first of the riders appeared on the horizon. The riders appeared like shadows against the dying light of the horizon, their figures silhouetted against the amber glow of the setting sun. There were 5 of them, all mounted on sturdy horses, their faces hidden beneath the wide brims of their hats. The soft thud of hooves grew louder, each beat punctuating the air with a steady rhythm that made Cole's pulse race. He tightened his grip on the pistol, his knuckles white with tension. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they weren't here to trade pleasantries. Nara, still crouched low beside him, scanned the approaching riders with a practiced eye. "They're raiders," she murmured, her voice steady but laced with a cold certainty. "No doubt about it." Cole nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the group. He could see the way they rode, slow, deliberate, as if they owned the land they passed over. It was clear they had no intention of leaving any time soon. He had only one choice, fight or run. But with Nara beside him, he knew running wasn't an option. He'd never been a man to run, and certainly not now. "Stay low," he ordered in a hushed voice, watching as Nara adjusted her position, her body melding into the shadows. He could barely make out the faint glimmer of her eyes, sharp and calculating in the dim light. She was ready, prepared to do whatever it took to survive. The riders came closer, their faces becoming clearer. The first man had a jagged scar running across his cheek, a badge of violence that made Cole's stomach twist. The others were similarly hardened, their eyes empty of compassion, filled only with the hunger for conquest and destruction. "Stay behind me," Cole whispered to Nara, though he knew she didn't need the reminder. She was already positioned a few feet behind him, her hands steady as she reached for the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. Cole's fingers brushed the cold steel of his revolver. His heart thudded in his chest, the quiet tension of the moment thick in the air. The sound of the riders' horses grew louder, their hooves crashing against the earth like a foreboding drumbeat. Each step brought them closer, each second adding weight to the unbearable silence. Finally, the lead rider stopped his horse just a few feet from their hiding place, his eyes scanning the area, searching for any sign of movement. Cole held his breath, willing his body to remain as still as possible. Nara did the same, her body taut with anticipation. The leader's voice broke the silence. "I know you're out there," he called out, his voice gruff and commanding. "Come on out and we'll make this easy." Cole's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't move. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The wind shifted, and for a moment the leader's horse snorted, its hooves scraping against the ground. It was enough to break the tension. The moment had arrived, and without warning, the leader's hand shot up, signaling the rest of the riders to spread out. They knew they were dealing with something more than just a simple robbery. Cole's eyes darted to Nara, who gave a small nod. She was ready. The next few moments would define everything. The first rider, a younger man with dark eyes and a cruel smile, made his move. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. Before he could make a full step, Cole was already in motion, drawing his revolver with lightning speed. The young man barely had time to react before Cole fired, the shot ringing out in the still air. The rider stumbled back, clutching his side where the bullet had struck. His breath came in shallow gasps as he fell to the ground, his horse rearing up in confusion. The other raiders immediately reacted, drawing their guns and shouting. The quiet night exploded into chaos, the sound of gunfire cutting through the air like thunder. Cole dove behind a large boulder, using it as cover while he fired another shot, taking out another rider who had tried to flank him. Nara, though visibly shaken, held her ground. She ducked low, moving swiftly and silently. Her knife was in her hand, the blade gleaming in the firelight. She knew her moment had arrived. She was no stranger to violence, no stranger to survival. With a swift, practiced motion, she threw the knife, striking one of the raiders in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his gun and clutching at the wound, but Nara was already on the move again. The fight had descended into pure chaos. The remaining raiders scattered, each trying to find an angle to attack, but Cole and Nara were a force to be reckoned with. They were a team, each movement calculated, each shot and strike aimed with precision. The sound of gunfire echoed in the canyon, a reminder of the brutality that had followed them from the moment they met. The last of the raiders, the one with the scar, realized that they were outmatched. He turned his horse sharply, intending to flee, but Cole was faster. He fired one last shot, catching the man in the leg. The raider howled in pain as he fell from his horse, crawling across the dirt, desperate to escape. "Don't think you're getting away," Cole growled, stepping forward, his gun still aimed. The raider raised his hands, pleading for mercy. But Cole wasn't listening. He had no mercy left for men like this. Nara stepped forward, her expression unreadable, as she surveyed the wreckage. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, but the battle was over. They had survived. They had won. "Are you all right?" Cole asked, his voice rough but soft as he looked at Nara. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm fine, but we need to leave." "They won't be the last." Cole's eyes hardened as he looked down at the fallen raiders, the firelight flickering in their eyes. He knew she was right. This wasn't over, but for now, they had made it through another night. "Let's go," Cole said, holstering his gun. "We've got a long road ahead." Nara nodded, and together they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of the past. Their future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were stronger together, and they weren't backing down from whatever came next. The night was far from over, and the winds had picked up, sweeping dust across the desert floor like a shroud. Cole and Nara moved swiftly through the canyon, staying low and using the rocks for cover. The air was cool against their skin, but it didn't ease the tension that gripped their bodies. Every sound, every rustle of the wind set Cole on edge. The gunfight had taken a toll, but it was only a temporary victory. He knew there was more to come. There always was. Nara walked beside him, her movements fluid, almost graceful despite the chaos they had just escaped. She was quieter than usual, her eyes scanning the dark landscape, always alert. She hadn't spoken much since the battle. But Cole didn't press her for answers. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. She had her reasons, her pain, just as he had his. And in that silence, they understood each other better than any words could convey. "I think we're safe for now," Cole muttered, his voice low as they reached the cover of a small grove of mesquite trees. He stopped and crouched, listening carefully to the sounds around them. The wind howled through the branches, but there was no sign of the raiders following them. Still, Cole wasn't ready to let his guard down. Not yet. "We'll need to move by dawn. We can't stay in one place for too long." Nara nodded, her face shadowed by the darkness, but Cole could see the faint flicker of resolve in her eyes. She was more than just a survivor. She was a fighter. And despite everything that had happened, she was still standing. That fact, in itself, was something to be admired. As they sat by the fire, the crackling flames the only source of light in the darkness, Cole began to unwrap some of the supplies they had taken from the raiders. A few cans of beans, dried jerky, and a water bottle. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get them through the night. Nara didn't reach for the food right away. Instead, she stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, a quiet that spoke of survival and the fragile peace that followed chaos. "You're not like the others," Nara said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She didn't look at him when she spoke, but Cole could hear the weight of her words. "The others, they would have killed me, left me for dead." She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "You didn't—" Cole paused, unsure how to respond. He had never been a man of many words, and certainly not when it came to matters of the heart. But something about her statement made his chest tighten. He had saved her. It was true, but it wasn't for any noble cause. It was simply because, in that moment, he couldn't leave her to die. And now, here they were, alone in the desert, two broken souls, trying to make their way through a world that had no mercy. "I'm not like them," Cole finally said, his voice rough. "I don't kill without reason. I don't leave people behind, not unless I have no other choice." He met her gaze, his eyes dark with a quiet intensity. "You deserve more than that, more than what they gave you." Nara's eyes softened for a moment, but then the hardness returned. She looked down at the ground, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders once again. "It's not about what I deserve," she said quietly. "It's about what I can survive." She paused, her fingers absently tracing the ground beneath her. "And I've learned that survival means doing things I never thought I could. It means giving up pieces of yourself along the way." Cole's heart sank at her words, but he didn't say anything. He knew what she meant. He had been there once, in the place where you had to decide just how much you were willing to lose in order to stay alive, and he wasn't sure if there was anything left to give. They ate in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the weight of the night settling in around them. When they finished, Cole stoked the fire, watching the flames dance as if they could somehow offer answers to the questions neither of them knew how to ask. "I don't want to be just another survivor," Nara said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. "I want more than that. I want to live." Cole glanced at her, seeing the fire in her eyes once more, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by the horrors she had witnessed. It was a fire he had long since buried, but now in her presence, he could feel it flickering to life again. The past had a way of making you forget what it meant to feel alive, but Nara was different. She hadn't forgotten. "I'll help you," Cole said, his voice steady. "I'll help you find that life. We'll get through this, Nara. Together." She didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice was softer, a trace of vulnerability in her words. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "I can't promise anything. I can't promise I'll be the person you want me to be, but I'll fight. I'll fight for what's left of me." Cole didn't answer right away. There was no need to. They both knew what the road ahead held. It would be dangerous. It would be uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Cole didn't feel alone. And maybe that was enough. The fire crackled, the stars above them endless and cold. But as they sat there, side by side, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The night passed slowly, the silence only broken by the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance and the crackle of the fire. Nara had fallen asleep first, her head resting on the blanket, her breathing slow and steady. Cole, however, could not sleep. He lay awake, staring up at the stars, his mind restless. There was too much weighing on him, the memory of the battle, the sound of the gunshots, and the girl beside him, who seemed so much more than just another survivor. She was a woman forged in the fires of her past, and he had a feeling that the road ahead would require all of her strength. He couldn't help but wonder what would become of them. In his line of work, survival was never guaranteed, and now, with Nara, things were no different. There were too many unknowns. But as he looked over at her, he realized something else. They had made it this far, maybe that was enough for now. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The air was cool, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The heat of the day would soon arrive. And with it, a new set of challenges. Cole knew they had to keep moving. Staying in one place was too risky, and if the raiders had sent scouts, they wouldn't stay hidden forever. He stood up quietly, making sure not to wake Nara. She needed the rest, but Cole knew their time was running out. The desert had a way of swallowing up those who didn't keep moving, and he wasn't about to let that happen. He packed up their supplies and made sure their horses were ready to go. He didn't know where they would head next. He just knew they couldn't stay here. Nara stirred as he finished packing, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she just stared at him, her gaze unfocused as if she was still lost in the fog of sleep. But then, as if remembering where she was, her eyes sharpened, and she sat up, rubbing her face with one hand. "We need to go," Cole said quietly. "We've got a long day ahead of us." Nara nodded, already gathering her things. She didn't speak, but her actions were decisive, each movement purposeful. Cole couldn't help but admire the way she handled herself. She had a quiet strength that came from surviving things most people couldn't imagine. It was a strength he recognized, even though it was foreign to him. "We'll head east," Cole continued, his voice low as he glanced at the rising sun. "There's a town about a day's ride from here. We can restock there, figure out our next move." Nara didn't respond right away, but she gave a small nod, signaling that she was ready. They both knew that the road to the town would not be easy. The raiders could be anywhere, and they couldn't trust anyone in these parts. But the town offered the best chance for supplies, and it might be their only chance for survival. As they mounted their horses, Cole glanced over at Nara, her face set in determination. She had a fire inside her that made him want to protect her, even if he didn't fully understand why. He had saved her once, but now she was more than just someone he needed to protect. She had become an equal, a partner in this fight for survival. And somehow, despite everything, he felt a connection to her that he couldn't explain. They rode in silence, the sound of hooves breaking the stillness of the morning. The desert stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand and rocks. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also unforgiving. Every step forward was a reminder of how fragile life was in this harsh world. Cole had learned that the hard way, and now, with Nara by his side, he knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat intensifying with each passing minute. Nara rode with a quiet grace, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Cole kept his gaze forward, his mind alert to every sound, every shift in the wind. He had spent too many years in this life not to be cautious, not to be prepared for the worst. Around midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a rocky outcrop. They were both tired, their horses exhausted from the long ride, but they couldn't afford to stop for long. Nara dismounted first, stretching her legs as she walked toward the edge of the outcrop, her eyes scanning the distance. Cole followed her, but he didn't speak. He knew better than to push her. She was a woman who didn't need saving, and in this world, that made her a rare breed. She was strong, capable, and unafraid. And that, in itself, made her dangerous. "We'll keep moving in an hour," Cole said, taking a swig of water from his canteen. He glanced at Nara, who was still watching the horizon. There was something in her gaze, something that told him she wasn't just thinking about the road ahead. She was thinking about everything that had brought her here, about the choices she had made, and the ones still to come. "I know," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel them coming." Cole turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Who?" "The raiders," Nara said, her voice steady but filled with a certain quiet certainty. "They're closer than we think, and they're not just after me." Cole's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what she meant, but he didn't ask. He already knew the danger they were in. The question was no longer if they would be found, it was when. "We'll be ready," Cole said, his voice firm. "If they want a fight, they'll get one." Nara nodded, her expression unreadable. She wasn't afraid. She was prepared, just like he was, and together they would face whatever came next, because in this world there was no room for weakness. Only the strong survived. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on them as they continued their journey east. The landscape around them was desolate, the terrain nothing but rolling hills of dry grass and jagged rocks. Every so often, the wind would stir the dust, creating small whirlwinds that danced across the ground like ghosts of the past. The world was silent, save for the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. Cole kept his eyes on the horizon, ever watchful for any sign of movement. He had learned long ago that silence was often the prelude to danger. He could feel it in the air now, a quiet tension that seemed to grow with each passing mile. Nara rode beside him, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She wasn't just waiting for the raiders to catch up. She was anticipating them, her instincts sharper than anyone he had ever known. As they rounded a bend in the road, Cole spotted something in the distance, a plume of dust rising into the sky. It was faint, but unmistakable. The raiders. They were closing in. "We need to get off the road," Cole said, his voice low but urgent. Now, Nara didn't hesitate. She spurred her horse forward, riding toward a narrow ravine that ran parallel to the road. Cole followed her, urging his own horse into a faster gallop. The ravine was their best option. It would hide them from the raiders and give them a chance to regroup. But the clock was ticking. They had to move fast, and they had to move smart. As they rode deeper into the ravine, Cole felt a wave of frustration rise in him. They were always running, always on the defensive. It was a life he had known too well, but it was a life he hadn't chosen for himself. Every time he thought they had found a moment of peace, the world seemed to remind him that peace was a fleeting thing. Nara slowed her horse to a trot, glancing over her shoulder at Cole. "They're coming," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that made Cole's gut twist. "I know," he replied, his hand tightening on the reins. "But we're not going to make it easy for them." They rode deeper into the ravine, maneuvering around boulders and scrub brush. Cole's mind raced as he thought of their next move. The raiders would have the advantage in numbers, but they had the terrain on their side. The ravine would limit the raiders' movement, forcing them to fight in tight quarters where speed would be a disadvantage. "Stay low," Cole instructed, his voice low as he glanced around. "Don't make any noise unless you have to." Nara nodded, her face set with determination. She had learned how to survive in these conditions, how to stay hidden when the world was out to get you. It wasn't about bravery. It was about knowing when to fight and when to hide. And right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. They continued down the ravine, the sound of hooves growing louder behind them. The raiders were getting closer. Cole could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins. His fingers brushed the revolver at his side, his mind already preparing for the worst. But Nara was calm. It was a calm that unnerved him, but it also gave him a sense of clarity. She was ready. Ahead, the ravine curved sharply, and Cole could see a narrow pass where the terrain flattened out. It was their best chance to make a stand. If they could reach it before the raiders did, they might have the upper hand. "We make our stand there," Cole said, pointing ahead. "Once we're in position, we don't move until it's over." Nara gave a small nod. "Understood." They urged their horses into a faster pace, moving with purpose, their breath steady despite the rising tension. The raiders were nearly upon them now, their figures visible through the dust and the haze. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more. Too many for a direct confrontation, but not impossible to deal with if they used the terrain to their advantage. As they reached the narrow pass, Cole motioned for Nara to dismount. She followed his lead, her movements fluid and practiced. They tethered their horses to the rocks, keeping them out of sight, then crouched low, using the natural cover of the ravine to conceal themselves. Cole checked his revolver again, making sure it was loaded. He wasn't sure how this would end, but he was ready. The sound of the raiders grew louder as they entered the ravine. Cole could hear them shouting to each other, their voices rough and grating. They were looking for them, but they didn't know where to look, not yet. "Stay behind me," Cole whispered to Nara. "I'll take the first shot." Nara didn't argue. She knew what had to be done. The raiders would come, thinking they had the advantage, but they were walking into a trap. Moments passed, the tension building with each second. Cole's heartbeat thudded in his chest as he listened for the sound of hooves, and then, suddenly, they were there. The first raider appeared at the edge of the ravine, his horse's hooves crunching against the dry earth. He paused for a moment, scanning the area, his eyes narrowed, but he didn't see them. Not yet. Cole's hand tightened around his gun, his finger brushing the trigger. He knew the moment was coming. It was now or never. The raider took another step forward, and that's when Cole fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the ravine. The raider collapsed, a startled shout escaping his lips as he fell from his horse. The other raiders reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. But it was too late. They had walked right into Cole and Nara's trap. And now there was no way out. The first shot shattered the silence, and chaos erupted. The raiders were quick to respond, but Cole and Nara were already in motion, each movement coordinated, each step precise. The raiders had underestimated them, and now they would pay the price. Cole dove behind a large boulder, taking cover as he fired again, hitting the second raider square in the chest. The man grunted, his body jerking back before he crumpled to the ground. The others hesitated for only a second, but that was all Cole needed. He popped out from behind the rock, aiming carefully at the third raider who was taking cover behind a nearby outcrop. A quick pull of the trigger, and the man fell, his weapon flying from his hands as he hit the dirt. Nara, meanwhile, moved like a shadow, her knife already in hand. She darted from one rock to the next, using the ravine's sharp turns and natural cover to her advantage. The raiders were disoriented, unsure of where the shots were coming from or how many of them were still out there. But Nara knew. She could hear their breathing, feel the tension in the air, and she used that to her advantage. One of the raiders, a taller man with a weathered face, made the mistake of trying to charge toward her. He had no idea where she was, only that he was hoping to flank her. Nara saw him coming and, with a fluid motion, threw her knife. It landed perfectly, embedding itself in his leg. He screamed in pain, stumbling, and for a moment he was completely vulnerable. Cole didn't hesitate. He lined up his shot and fired, taking the man down before he had a chance to draw his weapon. The fourth raider was now scrambling, retreating into the shadows, trying to get away from the carnage. But there was no escaping Cole's watchful eyes. He tracked the man's every move, waiting for the perfect moment. "I got this one," Cole muttered to himself, his voice calm, almost detached. He moved quickly, closing the distance between them in a few short steps, his boots crunching against the gravel. The raider turned just in time to see Cole approaching, but it was too late. A single shot rang out, and the last of the raiders dropped to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a heavy thud. The ravine fell into a sudden, eerie silence. The dust settled in the air, and the only sound now was the wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks. Nara, breathing heavily, stepped out from behind her cover, her eyes scanning the fallen bodies. She was calm, unshaken by the violence, as if it were just another part of the world she had been born into. Cole approached slowly, his revolver still in hand, his eyes never leaving the scene. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. Nara nodded, but there was no smile on her face, no sign of relief. It's never over, she replied quietly. There will always be more. Cole looked at her, seeing the weight in her words. She was right. This was just another battle in a long war, and no matter how many of them they took down, there would always be more waiting. But for now, they had won. They had survived. He holstered his gun and looked over at Nara. We can't stay here long. We need to get to the town, get supplies and move on. Nara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she kneeled by the body of one of the raiders, checking his pockets for anything useful. Cole watched her for a moment, then went to gather the horses. He knew she was right. Staying in one place would only attract more trouble. But for a brief moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of victory. They had made it through the fight. They had taken down the raiders and they were still alive. Let's go, Nara said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her hands, before anyone else shows up. Cole nodded and mounted his horse, glancing over at her. She was already on her horse, her eyes scanning the horizon, her expression unreadable. They rode out of the ravine together, side by side, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert floor. The road ahead was uncertain, but in that moment, they had one thing they could rely on: each other. The night air had a chill to it as Cole and Nara rode side by side, the sound of their horses' hooves the only thing breaking the eerie silence that surrounded them. The stars above were bright, but they offered little warmth in the desert's cold embrace. The world felt vast and empty. Just the two of them, heading toward an uncertain future, the weight of everything they had survived pressing down on their shoulders. Cole kept his eyes on the horizon, the faint outline of the town just visible in the distance. He didn't know what awaited them there. Supplies, maybe, or more trouble. In his experience, towns weren't safe. There were always people looking to take advantage of someone who appeared weak or out of place. But he had no choice. They couldn't survive in the wild forever. They needed rest, food, and ammunition. How far is it? Nara's voice broke through the stillness, and Cole turned to find her looking at him with an intensity that hadn't wavered since they left the ravine. Not far now, he replied, his voice low but steady. Maybe another hour or two. Nara nodded, but there was a hint of something else in her gaze. Something dark. She was no stranger to the world they lived in. She had seen the worst of it, and Cole suspected that she had learned to distrust the idea of sanctuary. She had learned to survive, and survival came with its own set of rules. Trusting anyone, anything, wasn't one of them. As they rode, Cole noticed her fidgeting with a small, worn piece of cloth she kept tucked in her jacket. It was a simple piece of fabric, but it had clearly been through a lot. It was faded, frayed at the edges, and had clearly seen better days. He had seen her touch it before, and he wondered what it meant to her, but he didn't ask. Some things weren't for him to know. Some things, he guessed, she would never share. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the smell of dust and earth. The ride was quiet, but the tension between them was palpable. They were both aware of the danger that still lurked out there, somewhere in the night. The raiders they had fought were just the beginning. There were others, just as ruthless, and they wouldn't rest until they found them. You know, Nara said, her voice softer now, I've never been to a town like this before. Cole glanced at her, but didn't slow his horse. What do you mean? Places like this, she said, her tone distant, where they don't know you, where you can disappear. Cole raised an eyebrow. So you're not planning to disappear, are you? Nara didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked ahead, her eyes scanning the landscape as if she were looking for something in the distance. After a long pause, she spoke again. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just running from everything I've lost, from what's been done to me, from what I've had to do. Cole didn't say anything at first. He understood the weight of her words. He had spent most of his life running too, though not for the same reasons. He had never had the luxury of feeling like he could stop. And now, here he was, stuck in the middle of this desert with a girl who had seen more pain than anyone should. The question wasn't if he could run anymore. It was whether or not he should. You don't have to run anymore, Cole said, his voice quieter now. Not with me. Nara turned to look at him, and for the first time, her expression softened, just for a moment, Maybe, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But sometimes it's easier to run than to face what's been done. Cole nodded, understanding all too well. He had been running his whole life, but this time something was different. This time, he wasn't alone. The town finally came into view, the flickering lights of lanterns casting long shadows against the buildings. It was a small place, no more than a handful of buildings clustered together, but it looked like a place that would offer them some respite, at least for the night. They slowed their horses as they neared the town, their movements cautious. Cole's eyes scanned the area, looking for signs of danger, but the town appeared quiet, the streets empty except for a few figures standing in front of the saloon, their eyes lazy but alert. As they reached the edge of the town, a man stepped out from the shadows, his hand resting casually on the handle of a revolver. "You two lost?" he asked, his voice rough and low. Cole stopped his horse, his gaze steady. "No, just passing through." The man didn't seem convinced. He looked them over, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nara. "You sure about that?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "You two don't look like you belong here." Cole didn't flinch. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just need supplies. We'll be gone by morning." The man studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly, a grin pulling at the corner of his lips. "All right, then. Just remember, this ain't a friendly place for folks like you." Nara tensed at his words, but Cole didn't react. He had heard it all before, warnings, threats, and empty promises. It was all part of the game they played. But they didn't have time for games. They needed to get what they needed and move on. "We'll keep that in mind," Cole said, nudging his horse forward. Nara followed, her expression unreadable. The man stepped aside as they entered the town, his eyes lingering on Nara for just a moment longer than necessary. Cole didn't like it, but there was nothing he could do about it now. They were in. As they made their way to the saloon, Cole could feel the eyes of the town on them, watching from every corner, every window. It was the kind of town where strangers weren't welcome, where trust was a luxury, and where survival came at a price. "Stay close," Cole muttered to Nara as they entered the saloon. Nara didn't answer. She didn't need to. They had made it this far. Now, they had to make it through the night. The saloon was dimly lit, its air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and tobacco smoke. It was a place where stories were traded as much as drinks, where men came to forget their troubles or to start new ones. The creak of the old wooden floors echoed as Cole and Nara stepped inside, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them. The murmur of conversation fell to a hushed whisper as they entered, the eyes of the few patrons lingering just a moment too long. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard and a weathered face, didn't seem surprised to see them. He'd seen enough strangers come and go in his time. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly, as he wiped down a glass with a rag. "We're just passing through," Cole said, keeping his tone even, "looking for some supplies." "Water. Food." The bartender nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to Nara before returning to Cole. "We got what you need," he said, his voice quiet, almost too quiet. "But around here, folks don't trust strangers unless they've got something to trade." "You got money?" Cole reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. He placed them on the bar, watching as the bartender counted them, his fingers moving with practiced speed. "All right," the bartender muttered, sliding the bills into the till. "I'll get you some water. Food's in the back." As the bartender turned to retrieve their supplies, Cole glanced around the room. The few men sitting at the tables didn't take their eyes off him, their gazes hard and calculating. They were used to watching strangers, and Cole knew that they saw him for what he was, a man who didn't belong. The saloon wasn't the sort of place where you made friends quickly, especially when you were riding into town with a young Apache girl. Nara, standing next to him, seemed unaffected by the stares. She stood with a calmness that reminded Cole of the quiet before a storm, the kind of stillness that masked a hidden danger. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of the men, the layout of the saloon, everything. She was already assessing their options, already preparing for what might come next. The bartender returned with a pitcher of water and 2 glasses. He set them down on the counter, eyeing Cole and Nara with a slow, measured look. Water's free. But food, that'll cost you extra, the bartender said, wiping his hands on his apron. You'll want to keep a low profile. There's not much to do here, but the people who come through, they usually don't stick around long. Cole nodded, his hand hovering over the glass. We'll be gone by morning, he said, his voice firm, but not giving away too much. He wasn't sure what he was saying. He knew the town could be trouble, but at least for now, they were safe. The bartender studied them for another moment, then shrugged and walked away. The men at the table slowly went back to their own conversations, but their eyes still lingered on Cole and Nara. The quiet tension in the room was palpable. Cole couldn't help but feel the weight of the stairs on his back, as if they were sizing him up, looking for any weakness, any reason to make trouble. Nara, to his surprise, wasn't fazed by the atmosphere. She was already moving, finding a small table at the far end of the room, away from the crowd but still within the bartender's line of sight. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes scanned the room one last time, and then she turned her gaze to Cole. "Do you think they know who we are?" she asked, her voice low, barely audible over the hum of conversation. Cole didn't answer right away. It was a question that didn't need an answer. They both knew that anyone who had been around long enough could sense when trouble walked into a room. And trouble was exactly what they were. No one had to know their names or their history to know that Cole and Nara didn't belong here. But for the moment, they had a few hours of relative peace, and Cole intended to make the most of it. "They don't know anything," Cole said finally, taking a seat across from Nara. He poured a glass of water and took a long sip. "They're just curious, and that's fine. We'll stay out of their way, get what we need, and move on." Nara didn't respond. She just watched him, her gaze steady, as if she were measuring him, weighing his words. It was the same way she had been since the beginning, always assessing, always calculating. It made Cole wonder how many people she had learned to trust, and how many times she had been let down. The bartender returned, setting 2 bowls of stew in front of them, the smell of the meat and beans filling the air. It was simple food, but it was a welcome change from the dry jerky and water they had been living on. Cole's stomach growled at the sight of the meal, but he kept his focus on Nara, who had yet to take a bite. She was still staring at him, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite place. "I know you're not just here for supplies," she said quietly, her voice calm but full of the weight of something unspoken. "Why did you help me?" "You didn't have to." Cole looked at her, his hand pausing mid-reach for his food. He had expected this question. He had been waiting for it, but he didn't know how to answer it without revealing more than he was ready to. There was no easy explanation for what had happened between them, no simple reason for why he had stepped in when he did. "I didn't want to leave you behind," Cole said finally, his voice rough. "And maybe I thought you deserved a chance at something better." Nara's eyes softened, just slightly, but it was enough for Cole to see that there was something in her, something buried deep, that wanted to believe him. She didn't answer right away, but he could feel the shift in the air between them. For the first time there was a connection, a brief, fragile bond formed in the fire of their shared struggle. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that it almost got lost in the noise of the saloon. Cole didn't respond. He simply nodded, his throat tight. He didn't need words. There were no promises here, no guarantees of what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at something more. The saloon buzzed around them, but for Cole and Nara, the world outside seemed to disappear. The hum of conversations, the clink of glasses, and the shuffle of boots faded into the background. For once, they were simply 2 people sharing a moment of relative peace, 2 survivors in a world that didn't often allow for rest. But even in the safety of the saloon, the weight of their pasts pressed down on them. Cole could feel it, a slow, creeping pressure that made his muscles tighten, his eyes darting back to the door every few seconds. He had been in enough places like this to know that peace was fragile. It could vanish in an instant. Nara had finished her stew, her bowl emptied, but she hadn't touched the bread that came with it. Her hands rested in her lap, and her gaze was distant, as though her mind had wandered far from the present. Cole studied her, watching the way her fingers tapped lightly against the wood of the table, the only sign of restlessness. "You don't trust this place, do you?" Cole asked, his voice low, more a statement than a question. Nara glanced up at him, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of something unreadable. She shook her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No, I don't trust it. People here, they're just like the ones who took everything from me. They'll smile to your face, but they'll stab you in the back the moment you turn around." Cole nodded, understanding. He had been the same way for years, distrustful, always on edge, always expecting betrayal. He had learned to survive by keeping his distance, to trust no one but himself. But something about Nara made him want to change that, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. She had a way of seeing the world that made him question his own hardened perspective. "You don't have to trust them," Cole said, his voice softer now. "But we need supplies, and we need to get out of here before someone notices we're not just passing through." Nara didn't argue, but there was a faint hesitation in her eyes, like she was weighing her options. For a moment, Cole thought she might say something more, but she remained silent. The unease between them lingered, but it wasn't the kind of unease that came from fear or tension. It was the kind of unease that came from shared understanding. They both knew that staying in one place for too long was a luxury neither of them could afford. Cole stood up, the wooden chair scraping across the floor as he pushed it back. He grabbed the last of the water and handed it to Nara, who accepted it without a word. They both knew what had to be done next. "Let's move," Cole said, his tone firm. "We'll head for the stables. Stay close, keep your head down, and don't make eye contact with anyone. We don't need to draw attention." Nara nodded and stood up with him, her movements as fluid and precise as ever. They made their way toward the door, Cole's hand resting casually on the handle of his revolver. The saloon doors creaked as they pushed them open, stepping out into the cool evening air. The town was quieter now, the last of the evening's light fading into dusk. The streets were still, the buildings casting long shadows across the dirt road. The saloon's faint glow receded behind them, and Cole could hear their footsteps echoing off the walls. The town felt abandoned, like something had been waiting for them to arrive. Something dark, something that wanted them to stay, if only for a little while longer. Nara's sharp eyes scanned the area as they walked. She moved with purpose, her posture unwavering. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she was ready for it, just in case. They reached the stables without incident, the horses still tied up where they had left them. Cole quickly checked their saddlebags, making sure everything was in place. He didn't want to risk any surprises along the way. The fewer things that could go wrong, the better. "You think they're going to let us leave quietly?" Nara asked, her voice steady but tinged with something else. Something dark, like she knew the answer before it was spoken. Cole paused, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The stables were quiet, and the town seemed to be settling into the stillness of night. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It was the kind of silence that came before something terrible, before a storm. "I don't think they're going to stop us," Cole said, his voice low and even. "But I don't trust them to let us go without a fight." The tension was back now, the unspoken weight of the world creeping up on them again. Cole could feel his heartbeat quicken as he adjusted his gun, ready for whatever might come next. The town had already shown them what it was capable of, and he wasn't about to underestimate it again. He didn't have time to linger, to wonder. He had to keep moving. They both did. Nara, as if reading his mind, turned to him with a look of resolve in her eyes. "Let's go, then," she said quietly, "before we become the next target." They mounted their horses, the sound of leather creaking as they settled into the saddles. The horses' hooves stirred the dust beneath them, and the quiet crept in again, more suffocating this time, as if the town was holding its breath. Cole nudged his horse forward, Nara following closely behind. The road ahead was still dark, but there was no turning back now. The world outside the town was unknown, and it wasn't about to get any easier. But for the first time, Cole didn't feel like he was facing it alone. With Nara by his side, they might just make it. As they rode away from the town, the only sound was the wind whispering across the barren land. The road ahead was long, and the night was heavy with uncertainty, but they were alive, and for now, that was enough. The town was soon behind them, swallowed by the dark horizon. The road ahead stretched out like a serpent in the desert, winding and uncertain. Cole kept his eyes on the path, his thoughts racing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence that had greeted them when they left the town had a different tone now. It was oppressive, full of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. They rode in silence, the only sounds the soft thudding of their horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind. Cole kept a steady pace, not wanting to push their tired mounts too hard. But the feeling in the air, that tightening of the chest that always came when danger was near, wouldn't go away. He didn't know what to expect, but he could feel it. Something was coming, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Beside him, Nara rode like she was born to it, her movements fluid and effortless. She seemed to have an instinct for the terrain, for the world around her that made her so much more in tune with it than anyone he'd ever known. She was different from anyone he had ever crossed paths with, more than just a survivor, more than just a person. She was a force, and it was that force that Cole had come to rely on, even if he didn't fully understand it. "How far are we from the next town?" Nara's voice broke through the silence, her words cutting through the tension that had been hanging between them like a fog. "About a day's ride," Cole replied, not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the distance, his mind focused on the road ahead. "We'll make it by sundown tomorrow if we keep this pace." Nara nodded, her face hard but unreadable. "Good." Cole glanced at her, wondering what was going on behind those eyes. She had been quieter than usual, her mind clearly elsewhere. He could see the shift in her, the way she held herself, the weight of something buried deep inside her. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt it. Something had changed. The road they were on now was desolate, stretching far into the empty desert. There were no signs of life for miles, just sand and rocks, and a sky that felt like it was closing in on them. Cole's mind kept returning to the moment in the saloon, when they had first made eye contact. The connection between them had been undeniable, and in some ways it had given him a sense of purpose. But now, out here in the vast emptiness, with nothing but the cold night air to keep them company, that connection felt different. It was like it had shifted, grown heavier with the weight of everything they had been through, and everything that still lay ahead. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Nara said suddenly, her voice low but sharp, as if she had been waiting to say it for a long time. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running." Cole turned his head toward her, surprised by the sudden break in her composure. She had always been the one who seemed so steady, so sure of herself, but now there was a crack in that armor, and it made him feel like he was seeing the real Nara for the first time. "We don't have to keep running," Cole said, his voice quieter now. "Not if you don't want to." Nara's expression softened, but there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. "You think we can just stop? You think we can find a place where we won't be hunted down, where I won't be a target?" Cole didn't answer right away. He had no idea what the future held, and he wasn't sure if they could ever find that kind of peace. But what he did know was that they had come this far, and they weren't about to give up now. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice steady. "We've been through worse. We'll make it through this, too." Nara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost uncertain. "What if I don't want to survive anymore?" The words hit Cole like a punch to the gut. He had always known that Nara had her demons, that she carried more weight than she let on. But hearing her say it aloud made him realize just how much of it she had been carrying alone. He had never asked her to explain herself, never pushed her for answers. He hadn't wanted to know the details of her past, but hearing her now, feeling the rawness of her pain, made him realize that they were both stuck in this cycle of survival, neither of them truly living, just getting by. "You don't have to carry it all alone," Cole said quietly. "You don't have to carry any of it, not anymore." Nara didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at him, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. It was a look that made Cole feel like he was standing at the edge of something big, something that could either bring them closer together or tear them apart. "You can't save me, Cole," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "Not the way you want to." Cole didn't know how to respond to that. He had always believed that he could fix things, that he could find a way to make everything right. But now, with Nara, he wasn't sure what that even meant. Could he save her from her past? Could he save himself? "I'm not trying to save you," Cole said after a long pause. "I'm just trying to be here, with you." The words felt awkward coming out of his mouth, but he meant them. He wasn't trying to fix her or make everything perfect. He just wanted to be part of her world, to share it, even if it was for a little while. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. They rode in silence for a while longer, each of them lost in their thoughts. The desert stretched out around them, the empty horizon both a prison and a promise. They didn't know what would come next, whether they would find safety or more danger. But they did know one thing: they weren't in this alone anymore. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. They were still a long way from the next town, but they were a little closer to something else now. Maybe it wasn't peace, but it was something they could build on. "Let's get some rest," Cole said, breaking the silence. "We'll keep moving tomorrow." Nara nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told him they might just be able to keep going, together. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving a cold stillness in the air that pressed in around them. The world was quiet, save for the soft sound of hooves in the dust and the occasional rustle of the wind through the sparse desert brush. It was the kind of silence that settled into your bones, that made you aware of how alone you really were, even when you weren't. Cole and Nara had stopped at the base of a small ridge, their horses grazing quietly in the shadows. The desert stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand and rock. There was nothing here to give them shelter, no sign of life beyond the occasional bird of prey circling overhead. It was just them, the silence, and the dark horizon that seemed to go on forever. Nara had started a fire, the small flames crackling against the night air, but her mind wasn't on the warmth it provided. She stared into the flames, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Cole could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed around the small stone she had picked up earlier. She wasn't just tired. She was deep in thought, and he could feel it, too. There was something in the air between them, something unsaid, something that had been building ever since they had left the town behind. "We could keep going," Nara said quietly, breaking the silence. "We could keep riding until we find somewhere to disappear, somewhere far away." Cole watched her, his hand resting on the ground beside him. He had heard her voice like this before, flat, almost detached, as if she were already planning her escape, as if she didn't think there was any other choice but to keep running. It was a voice that had been shaped by too many losses, too many fights, and too many decisions that had led her down this road, a voice that told him she didn't believe there was any way to outrun her past. But Cole wasn't sure anymore that running was the answer, not for him, not for her. "You can't keep running forever," he said softly, his voice steady as he watched her. "None of us can." Nara didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the fire, the way the flames danced and flickered in the cool desert air. It was as if she were trying to lose herself in the flames, to escape the weight of his words. "I don't want to be trapped," she said after a long moment. "I don't want to be stuck in a place where I don't have a choice, where I can't leave." "You don't have to be trapped," Cole replied, his voice softer now. "You're not alone anymore." Nara turned to look at him then, her eyes shadowed with uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The quiet stretched out between them, filled with all the things they hadn't said yet, all the things that were still hanging in the air like smoke. "I'm not asking you to stay," Nara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking you to make promises you can't keep. I'm just tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending like I have any idea what comes next." Cole stood up then, slowly, making his way to where she sat by the fire. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to make her believe that there was something worth holding on to, that there was something, someone, worth fighting for. But he couldn't just walk away. Not now. "I'm not going anywhere," Cole said, his voice steady. "I'm with you, Nara. I'll be here as long as you need me." Nara didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. And for a moment, Cole wasn't sure if she would ever trust him, if she would ever allow herself to believe that he meant what he said. But then, slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice soft and uncertain. Cole didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix. All that mattered was that they were here, together, in this moment, with the fire between them and the night stretching out ahead like an endless road. They sat there for a while, neither of them speaking, just listening to the sounds of the desert, the crackle of the fire, the soft snorting of their horses, the distant call of a coyote. The world was wide and empty, and yet it felt like they had carved out a space for themselves in it, a small, fragile space where, for the first time in a long time, they didn't have to fight to survive. And then, as if it had been waiting for them, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Low at first, distant, but it was unmistakable. Someone was coming. Cole stood up quickly, his hand already reaching for his revolver. He motioned to Nara, who had already risen to her feet, her body tense, ready for whatever might come next. They didn't have to speak. They both knew what had to be done. The riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the darkening sky. At first there were only two, but then more emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly toward them. Cole's eyes narrowed. They were raiders, or worse. No one else rode through the desert at night. But they weren't going to let this stop them. They had come too far, and if this was the fight they had to face, then so be it. "Get behind me," Cole said to Nara, his voice low and commanding. "We don't have much time." As the riders drew closer, Cole's heart beat faster. There would be no running this time, no more hiding. It was time to stand and fight. He wasn't alone anymore. They both had something to fight for. The first rider rode into the clearing, his face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. Cole's fingers tightened on the grip of his revolver. Nara's knife was already in her hand, her expression set with a deadly calm. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Then the silence shattered with the first crack of a gunshot. The first shot echoed across the desert, sharp and sudden. The raiders had made their move, but Cole had already seen them coming. He had no intention of waiting for them to make the first strike. He raised his revolver with practiced speed and fired, the bullet finding its mark in the chest of the nearest rider. The man crumpled from his saddle, his body tumbling to the ground with a sickening thud. Chaos erupted in an instant. The other raiders reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and spurring their horses forward. Nara moved with the same fluidity she always did, her knife already in her hand as she ducked behind a large boulder. She was swift, precise, disappearing into the shadows, her form barely a flicker in the dim light. Cole didn't wait. He had no time to waste. The remaining raiders were circling, trying to get a better angle. One of them fired at him, but Cole was already moving, diving behind a rock for cover, the bullet whizzing past his ear. He could hear the whinnying of the horses, the shouts of the raiders, but none of it mattered. He was focused, laser-focused on the task at hand. Survive. Protect Nara. Fight. Nara had already taken her position, using the rocks to her advantage. She didn't fire a shot, didn't make any noise that could give away her position. Instead, she was waiting for the right moment, her sharp eyes scanning the chaos, calculating her next move. She was faster than any of them, faster than Cole had anticipated. A rider emerged from the dust, making a wide arc around the area to flank Cole. He was quick, too quick for Cole to get a clear shot. The man was almost upon him when Nara's knife flew through the air. It struck the raider in the shoulder, causing him to scream in pain and lose control of his horse. The beast veered to the side, throwing the rider into the dirt, where he landed with a loud grunt. The raider struggled, trying to regain his footing, but Nara was already there, her knife in her hand, ready for the kill. With a sharp twist of her wrist, she ended it in a single motion. The raider slumped, his life fading quickly as she stood over him, breathing heavily. There was no hesitation, no second thought. She was a machine, precise, brutal, and efficient. But Cole couldn't help but feel a flicker of something else in her eyes, a fleeting moment of satisfaction, mixed with something darker, something that told him the violence she had witnessed was something she had become too familiar with. Cole was still behind cover, but he had no more time to think about it. The remaining three raiders were closing in, their shots becoming more accurate. the sound of their revolvers filling the air like thunder. One of them, a big man with a scar running down his cheek, was on the other side of the rocks trying to flank them. He wasn't as quick as Nara, but he had strength, and he was closing in on her position. Without thinking, Cole rushed out from behind his cover. He fired once, twice. His shots were precise, but he knew he had only one chance. The first shot missed. The second hit. The scarred man dropped to the ground, his face twisted in surprise as he realized he had been outsmarted. But Cole wasn't done yet. There were still 2 raiders left, and they were closing in. Cole's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He was no longer thinking about strategy or tactics. He was thinking only of survival. He dashed across the open ground, running for the next piece of cover. But a bullet grazed his shoulder, sending a sharp pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, but he didn't slow down. The last 2 raiders were circling back toward him, their eyes filled with murderous intent. They had the advantage now, their positions better than his. He was out in the open, and they had him in their sights. That's when Nara struck again. She appeared out of nowhere, moving like a shadow in the night. She had one of the raiders in her sights, and before Cole could react, she threw another knife. It landed squarely in the man's chest, and he let out a scream before falling from his horse. Cole didn't even have to think. He turned and fired, taking down the last man with a single shot to the head. The raider's body crumpled to the ground, his horse rearing up in confusion as the lifeless body slid from the saddle. The desert fell silent again. The air was thick with dust, the smoke of gunpowder still lingering in the air. Cole and Nara stood amidst the wreckage, their chests rising and falling as they tried to catch their breath. Nara looked around at the fallen raiders, her expression blank, unreadable. She wiped the blood from her knife and slid it back into its sheath. Cole didn't move. He was still processing what had just happened. In the heat of the moment, it had been about survival, about getting through the fight. But now, standing over the bodies of the raiders, the reality of what they had just done hit him. It was over. They had won. But at what cost? He looked at Nara, but she was already moving, already walking toward the horses, her steps purposeful, unbroken. She didn't look back at him, didn't offer any words of congratulations or thanks. She just kept moving. Cole followed her, the weight of everything they had just done settling on his shoulders. This was their world now. It wasn't about glory, and it wasn't about justice. It was about surviving the next day. And as he walked away from the battlefield, he knew they weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. The stars above them glittered coldly as Cole and Nara made their way back toward the horses, their steps heavy but purposeful. The fight was over, but the weight of it all, of everything they had survived, still clung to them like the dust of the desert. The bodies of the raiders lay behind them, forgotten now, just another chapter in a long and violent story that neither of them had chosen, but both had become a part of. The world didn't care who they were, what they'd been through. It just kept turning, and they kept moving. Cole reached for his horse, a simple brown mare that had carried him through more miles of desert than he could count. Nara was already on her horse, the quiet strength in her movements as steady as ever. She didn't look at him as he mounted his own horse, didn't offer a word of thanks or acknowledgement, but there was something different in the way she carried herself, something subtle, like the weight of the past was a little lighter, even if just for a moment. They both knew that nothing had truly changed. The raiders were dead, but there would be others. There always were. This life, this endless fight for survival, didn't end with a single victory. It wasn't like the stories of heroes riding off into the sunset. It wasn't like they could just leave all of this behind and find peace. Peace wasn't a luxury in the world they lived in. They rode in silence for a while. The only sound, the steady beat of their horses' hooves against the ground. The world around them was vast, the night stretching on forever. But the road ahead was still uncertain. There were towns, sure, places where they could find food, rest, maybe even some semblance of safety. But there were always new threats, new dangers. The world wasn't kind to people like them. It was a world that took more than it gave. Finally, it was Nara who broke the silence. "We can't stay here forever," she said, her voice low but steady, as if she had already accepted the reality of their lives. She was looking ahead, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll keep moving, keep fighting. But we can't stay here." Cole nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. "I know," he replied. "I don't plan on staying anywhere for long." They had both known from the start that this wasn't a life built for roots. It wasn't a life that allowed for comfort or stability. They had each other now. But that didn't change the fact that the world was still a dangerous place. They had survived this fight, but there would always be another. Always another town, another challenge, another choice to make. The truth was, they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what the future held, what paths they would walk down. All they knew was that they couldn't stop, couldn't look back. There was only the next step forward, the next fight to survive. As they rode deeper into the desert, the silence between them became less uncomfortable, less heavy. The weight of the night seemed to lessen with each mile they covered. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long while, Cole felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe it was because Nara wasn't just someone he had to protect anymore. She was someone who understood what it meant to fight, to survive and to keep going, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. Cole glanced over at her, her face illuminated by the faint light of the moon. She looked so young, but there was a wisdom in her eyes, a knowing that made him realize just how much she had already endured. She had seen things, lived through things that most people couldn't imagine. And yet, she was still here, still fighting. "You know," Cole said, his voice quieter than usual, "I'm glad I found you." Nara glanced over at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ask for you to find me," she said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet truth. She had never asked for anyone to save her, and she hadn't asked for anyone to care. "I know," Cole replied, his voice firm but gentle, "but I'm glad I did." There was no need to say more. They both understood. There was no grand declaration of friendship, no promises of loyalty or protection. They didn't need those things. They needed each other in the way only two people who had survived the impossible could understand. They didn't need to explain it. They didn't need to put it into words. They rode through the night, the desert stretching endlessly before them. The moonlight bathed the land in a cold, silvery glow, and the world around them felt both vast and intimate, like they were the only two people who truly understood the weight of the journey ahead. And so they kept moving, side by side, with the desert as their witness. There were no promises, no certainty, only the knowledge that they had each other, and that was enough, for now. The stars above them were countless, scattered like the dreams of 1,000 souls. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, Cole allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive this world, together. Because in the end, survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about finding a reason to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. And in the darkness of the desert night, with the wind at their backs and the future unknown, they had that reason. Cole and Nara ride toward an uncertain future, but together they've found something worth fighting for. In a world that takes more than it gives, survival isn't just about living. It's about having someone to walk through the darkness with. What comes next? Only time will tell, but as long as they're together, they'll face it. Like, subscribe, and share this story with those who need to hear it. Every fight deserves to be witnessed. Stay strong, and we'll see you on the next ride.